You have no idea what you're wearing, kid. The words hit the diner like a gunshot and every fork stopped moving. 17-year-old Ethan Walker froze in the doorway, his grandfather's cracked leather jacket hanging off his shoulders, a faded patch on the back that made grown men hardened. Hell's Angels among them go completely silent. Nobody had seen that patch in 30 years. And nobody, not one person in that room, was going to tell him why. Welcome back, everyone. If you're new here, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end because this story is going to shake you. And before we start, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Ethan didn't understand what he'd walked into. He'd just come from a long shift at his Uncle Reyes' garage, grease still under his fingernails, and he'd thrown the jacket on because the desert air had turned cold the way it always did once the sun dropped behind the ridge. It was an old habit by now, 3 months since his grandfather's funeral, and the jacket had become something like a second skin. Heavy, cracked at the elbows, smelling faintly of motor oil and cigarette smoke that had probably soaked into the leather decades before Ethan was even born. He pushed open the door of Rosie's diner, expecting the usual. The hum of the jukebox, the clatter of plates. Rosie herself yelling at somebody to refill the coffee. Instead, he got silence. Thick, heavy, the kind of silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. A table of old veterans near the window had stopped mid-sentence, cards frozen in their hands. 2 bikers in cuts by the counter turned slowly like their necks had been cranked by a machine. And near the back, 3 men wearing the unmistakable colors of the Hells Angels lowered their drinks at the exact same moment, staring at Ethan like he'd walked in carrying a loaded weapon instead of a beat-up jacket. Ethan said, glancing behind him like maybe the silence was about something else. Is somebody dying back there or something? Nobody laughed. Rosie, the owner, a heavy-set woman in her 60s who'd known Ethan since he was in diapers, came around the counter with a coffee pot still in her hand, and her eyes went straight to his back. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Rosie, Ethan said, you okay? Where'd you get that jacket, baby? Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. It was my grandpa's. You know that. I've worn it in here 100 times. Not with the patch showing, she said. You always had it folded under, or you wore it inside out. I never... She stopped, herself glanced nervously toward the back table where the 3 Hells Angels sat like statues. Just sit down, honey. Sit down at the counter. Ethan didn't move right away. He was 17, not stupid, and something about the way 6 grown men were staring at a piece of stitched leather made every instinct in his body tell him to turn around and walk right back out. But he was also hungry and stubborn, and he'd be damned if he let a room full of old bikers scare him out of a cheeseburger. He sat. The whispering started almost immediately. Not loud enough for him to catch all of it, but loud enough that fragments drifted over. That's Billy's kid. No way. Billy Walker's grandson. I thought that patch burned with the old clubhouse. Somebody needs to call. Call who? Ethan wanted to ask. Call who? One of the veterans at the window table, an old man with a Vietnam cap and hands that shook slightly around his coffee cup, leaned toward his buddy and said just loud enough for Ethan to hear, that boy's gonna get himself killed wearing that in public. Ethan's stomach dropped. Excuse me, he said, turning in his seat. What did you just say? The old man's friend put a hand on his arm, a warning. The first veteran just shook his head and looked back down at his coffee like he hadn't spoken at all. Hey, Ethan said, louder now, standing up. I asked you a question. What do you mean I'm gonna get killed? Ethan, Rosie's voice sharp, sit back down. No, everybody in here is looking at me like I'm wearing a target on my back and nobody will tell me why. This was my grandfather's jacket. He's dead. He's been dead 3 months. What is everybody's problem? The diner stayed dead quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to lower itself. Then the door opened. A gust of desert wind rolled in, first dry and sharp, and behind it walked a man Ethan had never seen before, tall, gray-bearded, maybe in his 60s, wearing a leather vest so worn it looked like it had survived a war. He didn't have colors on it, no patch, no club insignia, just plain leather and a face carved out of 40 years of hard road. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes found Ethan immediately, and something moved behind them. Recognition. Maybe grief. Maybe both. Well, I'll be damned, the man said quietly, almost to himself. Every single person in that diner turned to look at him. He walked toward Ethan slowly, like his knees hurt with every step, and stopped about 3 feet away. His eyes went to the patch on the back of the jacket, then to Ethan's face, then back to the patch like he was trying to convince himself of something. "Do I know you?" Ethan asked, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. "No," the man said. "But I knew him. Better than anybody in this room, probably better than anybody left alive." He nodded toward the jacket. "That patch. You know what it means? It's my grandfather's, William Walker. Everybody called him Billy." The man let out a breath that sounded like it had been held in for 30 years. "I know exactly who it belonged to, son." He pulled out the stool next to Ethan and sat down without asking. "Name's Cole Bennett. I rode with your grandfather back before you were even a thought in anybody's head." "Okay," Ethan said carefully. "So why does everybody in here look like they saw a ghost?" Cole studied him for a long moment. "Because in a way they did." He glanced around the diner at the frozen faces at the 3 Hells Angels in the back who still hadn't touched their drinks. "You have no idea what you're wearing, kid." There it was again. That sentence. The one that had already been circling Ethan's skull since he walked through the door. "Then tell me," Ethan said, "because I'm getting real tired of people talking about my grandfather like he's some kind of secret." Cole rubbed a hand over his beard, thinking choosing his words like each one cost him something. "Your grandfather wasn't just some rider who put around on weekends, Ethan. Before you were born, long before Billy Walker was a name that meant something in this state. Meant something to people who protected each other when nobody else would, and meant something to people who were scared of what he stood for." "Scared how?" "That's not a 5-minute conversation," Cole said. He looked over his shoulder toward the 3 men in the back, who were now watching the exchange with an intensity that made Ethan's skin crawl. "And it's definitely not one we're having here." "Why not?" Cole leaned in close, his voice dropping low enough that only Ethan could hear it. "Because there's a man 40 miles from here who spent 15 years building a name for himself, and he built it partly on the story that your grandfather was a coward who ran. If word gets back to him that Billy's grandson is walking around town wearing that patch like it's nothing, that's a problem. That's a big problem for you." Ethan's heart started pounding. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that gets people hurt," Cole said flatly. Rosie appeared at the counter again, setting down a coffee for Cole without being asked, her hands trembling slightly. "Cole Bennett," she said. "Been a long time." "Rosie," Cole nodded at her, a small, tired smile. "Still make the best pie in the county." "Better than ever. You want a slice, or are you here to scare this boy half to death?" "Bit of both, if I'm honest." Ethan looked between them, frustration boiling up in his chest. "Can somebody please just tell me what's going on? Everybody keeps talking around it like I'm supposed to already know." Cole's expression softened just slightly. "You're right, I'm sorry." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup like it was the only warm thing in the room. "Your grandfather rode with a club called the Sentinels back in the 70s and 80s. And for a while that club did good, real good. Protected families that had nobody else to protect them. Ran off men who preyed on the weak. Billy was the reason a lot of people in 3 counties slept safe at night." "So why's everybody scared of the name then?" "Because it changed," Cole said, and his jaw tightened. "Slowly at first, then all at once. New blood came in, men who wanted power more than they wanted honor. And your grandfather, he watched something he built with his bare hands turn into something he didn't recognize anymore. What did he do? He walked away, took the patch off his back, that exact patch you're wearing right now, and he never touched a motorcycle club again in his life. Far as anybody outside this town knew, Billy Walker disappeared. Some folks said he died. Some folks said he ran off with money that wasn't his. Some folks, Cole hesitated. Some folks said what? Some folks said he was a coward who couldn't handle what the club had become, and he abandoned the men who trusted him." Cole's voice was tight now, almost angry. "That's the story Marcus Kane tells anyway. And Marcus Kane is the man running what's left of that old organization now." The name landed in the diner like a stone dropped in still water. Ethan actually noticed the way 2 of the men in the back exchanged a glance at the mention of it. "Marcus Kane," Ethan repeated. "Don't say that name too loud in here," Cole muttered. "Why not?" Before Cole could answer, the bell over the diner door jingled again, and this time the silence that followed was different. Colder. One of the Hells Angels near the counter actually straightened his spine. A man walked in wearing a black leather vest, clean-cut mid-30s, with the kind of calm, controlled walk that made Ethan think of a wolf that had learned to disguise itself as a dog. He wasn't wearing colors either, but everybody in that diner recognized him anyway. "Well now," the man said, his voice smooth, almost friendly, scanning the room until his eyes landed directly on Ethan's back on the patch. "Would you look at that?" Cole's whole body went rigid beside him. "Danny," he said low and even. "Didn't expect to see you tonight. Wasn't planning on stopping," the man called Danny said, walking closer, eyes never leaving the jacket. "Then somebody called me and said Billy Walker's boy was sitting in Rosie's wearing his old man's patch like it was Halloween." He stopped a few feet away, tilting his head, studying Ethan the way someone studies a photograph they're not sure is real. "Didn't believe it. Had to see for myself." "His grandson," Cole corrected. "Not his boy." "Grandson boy doesn't matter much," Danny said, his eyes flicking to Cole. "Marcus is going to want to hear about this." Something in Ethan's chest turned to ice. "Who's Marcus Kane and why does he care what jacket I'm wearing?" Danny smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "Kid doesn't even know," he said, almost delighted. "That's rich." "Leave him alone, Danny," Cole said, standing up now, putting himself slightly between Ethan and the other man. "Relax, old man. I'm not here to start anything." Danny raised both hands in mock surrender, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan, just passing along a message free of charge. "You might want to take that jacket off, kid, before word travels further than it already has." He turned to go, then paused at the door, glancing back one more time. Billy Walker's dead and buried. Be a shame if his grandson followed him early. The door swung shut behind him and the diner exhaled all at once like everyone had been holding their breath. Ethan's hands were shaking. He hadn't even realized it until he looked down at them. "Was that a threat?" he asked Cole. "Did that guy just threaten to kill me?" Cole's face had gone pale under his beard. "That was Danny Reyes. He's Marcus Kane's second. And no," he sat back down slowly. "That wasn't a threat. That was a warning. Marcus doesn't send threats through his second. He sends warnings. The threats come later and they come from him personally." "This is insane," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "This is completely insane. It's a jacket. It's an old jacket that belonged to my grandfather. Why is everybody acting like I'm carrying a ball to show us Because to men like Marcus Kane," Cole said quietly, "a symbol is more dangerous than a bomb. A bomb kills people. A symbol reminds people what they used to believe in, and that's the thing men like Kane are most afraid of." Ethan sat back down slowly, his heart still racing the diner around him, slowly returning to its normal murmur, though quieter than before, more careful. "I need you to tell me everything," Ethan said. "Everything about my grandfather. Everything about this Marcus Kane guy. Everything about why I apparently can't wear a piece of my own family's history without getting death threats from strangers." Cole studied him for a long moment, something conflicted moving behind his eyes. "Your grandfather asked me for one thing before he died, Ethan. He asked me to leave you out of all this, let you grow up normal, let this whole chapter stay buried with him." "Well, it's not staying buried," Ethan said. "It just walked into a diner and threatened my life." Cole exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. "You're right." He looked up, and for the first time something like respect flickered across his face. "You sound like him. You know that same stubborn streak, same refusal to back down when things get complicated." "Then tell me the truth," Ethan said. "All of it." Rosie appeared again, sliding a plate of fries in front of Ethan. He hadn't ordered, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Eat something, honey. You're shaking." Ethan barely noticed the food. His eyes were locked on Cole waiting. Cole glanced around the diner one more time, making sure nobody else was listening too closely, then leaned in. "Your grandfather founded the Iron Sentinels with 3 other men back in 1974. I was there. I was 19 years old, and Billy Walker was the closest thing to a hero I'd ever met. We didn't run drugs. We didn't run guns. We protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Ranch families getting squeezed out by land developers, widows getting harassed by debt collectors, kids getting bullied by grown men who thought a badge or a bank account made them untouchable. Billy had this rule, carved it into the clubhouse wall himself. We ride for the ones who can't." "So what happened?" "Money happened," Cole said, bitterness creeping into his voice. "By the mid-'80s, the club had a reputation, and reputation attracts the wrong kind of attention. New members came in wanting the fear factor without the code behind it. Billy fought it for years, fought hard, but eventually the men who wanted power outnumbered the men who wanted honor, and Billy realized he couldn't win that fight from the inside anymore. So he left. He didn't just leave, Cole said. He tried to take the club back to what it was supposed to be one last time. Called a vote. Lost it badly, and the man who won that vote, Cole paused, his jaw tightening. Marcus Kane, Ethan said, understanding dawning cold and heavy in his stomach. Marcus Kane's father, actually, Cole corrected. Gerald Kane. Marcus was just a kid back then, barely older than you are now, watching his old man tear apart everything Billy built. When Billy lost that vote, he didn't just walk away quiet. He took the patch off his own back in front of the whole club and told them they'd lost the right to wear it. Told them the Iron Sentinels was dead the second it stopped protecting people and started preying on them. That must have made him some enemies. You have no idea, Cole said grimly. Gerald Kane never forgave him. Spent the rest of his life telling anybody who'd listen that Billy Walker was a coward and a traitor who abandoned his brothers. And when Gerald died 8 years ago, Marcus inherited that hatred like it was a family heirloom. Ethan sat with him that for a moment, the fries going cold in front of him, untouched. So Marcus Kane hates a dead man, he said slowly, and now he's going to take it out on me because I wore his jacket to a diner. It's more complicated than that, Cole said. There are still people alive, good people who remember what the Sentinels used to stand for, who never stopped hoping somebody would bring that back. When word spreads that Billy's blood is walking around wearing that patch again, it puts an idea in people's heads. An idea that maybe the old code isn't as dead as Marcus wants everyone to believe. And that's dangerous. That's very dangerous, Cole said, because if people start remembering what the Sentinels used to be, they start comparing it to what Marcus Kane has turned it into. And Marcus Kane did not build his entire operation on people looking too closely at that comparison. The diner door chimed again, and both of them tensed, but it was only an elderly couple coming in for pie, oblivious to the tension still hanging thick in the air. Ethan watched Cole visibly relax just slightly and understood for the first time just how frightened this grown man, a man who'd clearly seen things, survived things, actually was. I need to go home, Ethan said suddenly. My mom doesn't know any of this. If people are talking about me getting hurt, your mom knows more than you think, Cole said quietly. Ethan froze halfway out of his seat. What? Sarah Walker isn't just Billy's daughter-in-law by accident, kid. She knew exactly what she married into. Your father knew too before he passed. Cole's expression turned careful, almost apologetic. I think it's time you two had a real conversation. Ethan's mind was spinning out, questions stacking on top of each other, faster than he could sort through them. His father had died when he was 9, car accident, or so he'd always been told. Was that even true? Was anything he'd been told about his family? True, Cole, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Did somebody kill my father? The question hung in the air like smoke. Cole's face didn't move for a long moment, and that silence told Ethan more than any answer could have. That, Cole said finally, is a conversation you need to have with your mother, not with me, not in a diner. Ethan stood up fully now, his legs unsteady beneath him, the weight of the jacket suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had. I need to go. Ethan, Cole grabbed his wrist, gentle but firm. Listen to me. Whatever you find out tonight, whatever your mother tells you, do not take that jacket off. Not because of some tradition, because the second you take it off, you're telling every single person in this county that Billy Walker's family is scared and hiding. And Marcus Kane will read that as an invitation. An invitation for what? To make sure nobody ever wears that patch again, Cole said grimly. By any means necessary. Ethan pulled his wrist free, not out of anger, but out of the desperate need to move to get outside to breathe air that didn't feel thick with 30 years of secrets. He pushed through the diner door into the cooling desert night, the gravel parking lot lit by a single flickering street lamp, his truck sitting exactly where he'd left it 20 minutes in an entire lifetime ago. He didn't notice the black pickup parked across the street until he was almost at his own door. Didn't notice the man leaning against it, watching him with quiet, patient interest until the man spoke. Nice jacket, the stranger said, stepping half out of the shadows. Older, maybe 50, with a gray-flecked beard and forearms covered in faded tattoos, wearing a vest with patches Ethan didn't recognize. Patches that definitely weren't Hell's Angels colors, something else entirely. something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand straight up. Thanks, Ethan said, carefully reaching for his truck door. Your grandfather's right, the man said, not moving from where he stood. Word travels fast in this town. Ethan's hand froze on the door handle. Do I know you? No, the man said. But you will. He smiled, and it wasn't unkind exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. Name's Frank Delgado. Used to ride with your grandfather way back. Before Cole. Before any of it went sideways. He nodded toward the diner behind Ethan. I saw Danny Reyes come out of there about 10 minutes ago looking like he'd swallowed something bitter. Figured that meant somebody finally told you the truth. Some of it, Ethan said. Not all of it, apparently. Frank studied him for a long moment. Something thoughtful crossing his weathered face. You got your grandfather's eyes, you know, that same look he had right before he'd do something everybody told him not to do. What's that supposed to mean? Means I think you're going to keep wearing that jacket, Frank said. No matter how many people tell you it's dangerous. Means I think you're more like Billy than anybody's ready for including you. He pushed off the truck, standing up to his full height, and for a moment Ethan felt genuinely afraid, until the man extended a weathered hand instead. If you need somebody in your corner who isn't scared of Marcus Kane, you come find me. I still owe your grandfather a debt I never got to pay back. Ethan hesitated, then shook the offered hand. What kind of debt? The kind that saved my life, Frank said simply. Long time ago, in a way I'm not ready to tell a 17-year-old kid standing in a parking lot at night. But you go home, you talk to your mother, and when you're ready to hear the rest of it, the real rest of it, not the version Cole's too careful to tell you, you come find me at the old Sentinel garage on Route 9. I'll be there. He turned and walked into the darkness before Ethan could ask another question, disappearing around the corner of the diner like he'd never been there at all. Ethan sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes before he could make his hands steady enough to start the engine. Every part of him wanted to go straight to Uncle Reyes, to somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. But Cole's words kept echoing in his skull. Your mother knows more than you think, and underneath that, a colder thought that wouldn't leave him alone. Did somebody kill my father? He drove home in silence, the radio off his eyes, flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, checking for headlights that weren't there. The porch light was on when he pulled into the driveway, his mother's silhouette visible through the kitchen window, moving between the stove and the counter like it was any other Tuesday night. He sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at that warm, ordinary light, knowing that the second he walked through that door, nothing about his life was going to be ordinary again. He got out of the truck, walked up the porch steps, and as his hand touched the doorknob, he heard his mother's voice from inside, sharp with worry, already on the phone with somebody. No, he doesn't know Cole. I told you I was going to tell him when he turned 18. That was the plan. That was always the... A pause, her voice cracked. He's wearing it tonight. Oh God, is he safe? Is he... Ethan pushed the door open. His mother spun around, phone still pressed to her ear, and the color drained completely from her face when she saw the jacket, saw the patch, saw the look on her son's face that told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. Ethan, she whispered. We need to talk, Mom, he said, his voice shaking despite everything he did to steady it. About Dad, about Grandpa, about all of it, right now. Sarah Walker lowered the phone slowly from her ear, her eyes filling with tears that had clearly been waiting years to fall, and for a long, terrible moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then she nodded once and set the phone down on the counter. Sit down, she said quietly. This is going to take a while. Sarah Walker's hands trembled as she pulled out a kitchen chair, motioning for Ethan to sit across from her at the same table where they had eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners. Tonight it didn't feel ordinary. Tonight it felt like the edge of a cliff. Your father didn't die in a car accident, she said before Ethan could even settle into his seat. The words landed like a physical blow. Ethan gripped the edge of the table. What? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let you believe that for 8 years, but I need you to understand I did it to protect you. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through it like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head and was terrified she'd lose her nerve halfway through. Michael found out things about the club, about what Marcus Kane was really doing behind all the charity rides and the community fundraisers he uses to make himself look respectable. What things? Extortion. Families losing their homes because they couldn't pay what Marcus called protection. Old folks getting threatened if they didn't sell their land to companies that Marcus had his hands in. Sarah wiped her eyes fast, angry at her own tears. Your father wanted to expose it. He'd been collecting proof for almost a year, bank records, photographs, recordings. He told me he was going to bring it to the county sheriff himself. And then he died. Ethan said, his voice hollow. 2 days before he was supposed to hand it over, Sarah said, the official report said he lost control on Route 9 doing 60 in the rain. Michael never drove 60 on that road in his life. He grew up on that road. He knew every curve of it, blindfolded. Ethan's chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. You think Marcus Kane killed my father? I know he did, Sarah said, and for the first time her voice wasn't shaking. It was cold flat certain. I couldn't prove it. Nobody could. The evidence Michael collected disappeared from our house the same week he died. Somebody broke in, took nothing but a locked file box from the garage, and left everything else untouched. You don't rob a house and only take paperwork unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you go to the police? Because Billy told me not to. Sarah's eyes went distant for a moment, back to a memory Ethan couldn't see. Your grandfather came to me the week of the funeral, that's right where you're sitting now, and told me if I went digging any further, I wasn't just risking my life. I was risking yours. He said Marcus Kane doesn't leave loose ends, and a widow with a young son asking too many questions is exactly the kind of loose end men like that clean up quietly. Ethan sat with that, his mind spinning too fast to grab hold of any single thought. So we let it go. We let the man who killed Dad keep running around like nothing happened. We survived, Sarah said sharply. That's what we did. And it worked, Ethan, for 8 years. It worked because Marcus had no reason to think about us at all. We were nobody to him. Grief was our disguise. Her eyes dropped to the jacket he was still wearing, and her voice softened into something closer to fear than anger. And now you walked into Rosie's diner wearing the one thing in this entire town guaranteed to make Marcus Kane remember our name again. I didn't know, Ethan said, his voice breaking. Mom, I swear to God, I didn't know any of this. I just wore Grandpa's jacket because it was cold outside. I know, baby. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her grip fierce. I know you didn't know. That's exactly the problem. Billy kept you in the dark on purpose, and I went along with it, and now the two of us have to figure out how to fix a mess neither of us saw coming. A phone buzzed on the counter Sarah's still open from the call she'd been on when Ethan walked in. She glanced at it and her whole body tensed. Who was that? Ethan asked. Before, on the phone, you said Cole's name. Cole called me the second you left the diner, Sarah admitted. He was scared, Ethan. Cole Bennett does not scare easy. That man rode with your grandfather through things I can't even repeat to you, and he sounded scared. He told me Frank Delgado approached me in the parking lot. Sarah's face went white. Frank talked to you. Yeah, said he used to ride with Grandpa too. Offered to tell me the real story, whatever that means. Said to find him at some old garage on Route 9. Do not go anywhere near that man, Sarah said, standing up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. Ethan, I mean it. Frank Delgado is not your friend. Cole seemed to trust him. Cole doesn't know everything. Sarah snapped, then caught herself pressing her fingers to her temples like she was fighting off a headache that had been building for 8 years. I'm sorry. There's history there that's complicated. And tonight is not the night to get into all of it. Mom, you just told me my father was murdered and my grandfather ran a motorcycle club that apparently the whole county is terrified of. I think tonight is exactly the night to get into all of it. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite giving up, but recognizing she'd already lost this particular fight the moment Ethan walked through the door wearing that jacket. She sat back down slowly. Frank Delgado was one of the founding members alongside your grandfather, she said. Back in '74, when it all started. But when the club split, when Gerald Kane won that vote and pushed Billy out, Frank didn't leave with your grandfather. Frank stayed. Ethan's stomach turned. He stayed with the Kanes. For almost 20 years, Sarah said. He was Gerald Kane's right hand for most of the 80s and 90s. Did things during that time your grandfather never fully forgave him for even after Frank finally left and tried to make amends? So why would he want to help me? Guilt, probably, Sarah said. Or he's telling the truth about wanting to pay off some old debt. I don't know Frank's heart, Ethan. Nobody does. That's exactly why you don't go looking for him alone. The porch light outside flickered once, then steadied, and both of them went quiet listening. Nothing. Just the wind picking up outside, rattling the loose screen on the kitchen window. There's something else, Sarah said finally, her voice dropping lower. Something your grandfather left for you. He made me promise not to give it to you until your 18th birthday. But I think, she paused, looking at the patch on his jacket, at the fear still written plainly across her son's face. I think tonight changed the timeline. She stood, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down a shoebox from the highest shelf one Ethan had never once noticed in 17 years of living in that house. Her hands shook as she carried it back to the table and set it down in front of him. What is it? Ethan asked, almost afraid to touch it. Open it and find out. Ethan lifted the lid slowly. Inside sat a stack of old photographs, yellowed at the edges. His grandfather, younger, leaner, standing beside a row of motorcycles with 3 other men Ethan didn't recognize. All of them grinning like the world belonged to them. Beneath the photos, a folded letter, the paper soft with age, and beneath that, a small brass key with no label. Read the letter, Sarah said quietly. Ethan unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was rough slanted, clearly a man who'd spent more time on a wrench than a pen. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means either you turned 18 the way we planned or something happened that made your mother decide you needed to know sooner. Either way, I'm sorry I'm not there to tell you this myself. The jacket isn't just mine. It was never just mine. Every stitch in that patch represents a promise 4 men made to each other and to this town a long time ago, a promise that got broken by greed, but never by me. I want you to know that. Whatever anyone tells you about Billy Walker, know this. I never broke that promise. I paid for keeping it more than you'll ever know, but I never broke it. But there's a family in this town, the Ortegas, who run the little hardware store on Desert Vine Road. 40 years ago, I promised Ruth Ortega's father that the Sentinels would protect that family for as long as the club existed in exchange for something he did for us that saved 4 lives, mine included. I kept that promise myself for 30 years after the club fell apart. I don't know if I'll still be around to keep it when you read this letter. If I'm not, that promise falls to whoever's wearing this jacket. The key opens a lockbox at First Desert Bank Safety Deposit Box 114. What's inside will tell you the rest, and it'll tell you why some people in this town would rather you never learn the truth. I love you more than these words can hold. Be careful. Be smarter than I was. And remember, the patch doesn't make the man. The man makes the patch mean something. Grandpa, Ethan set the letter down, his eyes burning, his hands shaking harder than before. The Ortega family, he said slowly. The hardware store. I know that place. I've bought parts there my whole life. I know, Sarah whispered. Does Marcus Kane know about this promise? I don't know what Marcus knows, Sarah admitted. But if your grandfather made a promise like that, and men like Marcus Kane are still shaking down families in this town for protection money. She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air between them. Then the Ortegas might already be a target, Ethan finished. The knock on the door came so suddenly that both of them jumped, Sarah's hand flying instinctively to Ethan's arm, pulling him half out of his chair. 3 sharp raps, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of knock that belonged to somebody who wasn't afraid of being turned away. Stay here, Sarah whispered, moving toward the front hallway. Mom, stay here. Ethan stood anyway, his whole body coiled tight, watching his mother approach the door like it might be wired to something dangerous. She checked the peephole and her shoulders dropped a fraction, not fully relaxed but no longer braced for the worst. It's Ray, she called back, and Ethan felt his own breath rush out of him. Uncle Ray filled the doorway a second later, still in his grease-stained work shirt from the garage, his face tight with worry. He wasn't bothering to hide. Cole called me, he said without preamble, stepping inside and shutting the door hard behind him. Told me what happened at Rosie's. Ethan, are you hurt? Did anybody touch you? I'm fine, Ethan said. Ray, did you know about all of this, about Dad? Ray's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Sarah, a silent question passing between the 2 adults that Ethan couldn't fully read. Yeah, Ray said finally quietly. I knew. Billy was my brother, Ethan. You think I didn't know what happened to my own nephew? What that man did to my family? Then why didn't anybody tell me? Ethan's voice cracked frustration and grief tangling together until he could barely separate them. I've spent 8 years thinking my dad died because of bad weather and bad luck. Everybody just let me believe that. Because telling a 9-year-old boy his father was murdered by a man with an army of bikers behind him isn't protection. Ethan, it's a death sentence waiting to happen the first time you got angry enough to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. Rey's voice was rough but not unkind. We weren't hiding it because we didn't trust you. We were hiding it because we loved you too much to hand you a target before you were old enough to understand what carrying it meant. Well, I'm carrying it now, Ethan said, gesturing at the jacket still on his back. Whether anybody wanted me to or not. Rey's eyes dropped to the patch and something shifted in his expression. Grief, pride, fear, all tangled together in a way that made him look for just a moment exactly like an older, grayer version of the photographs in the shoebox. Show him the box, Sarah said quietly. Rey's eyes snapped to her. Sarah, he already knows about Dad. He already has the letter. He knows about the Ortegas. Sarah's voice was steady now, resigned in a way that suggested she'd made a decision somewhere in the last 5 minutes and wasn't turning back from it. He's not 9 years old anymore, Rey. He's not going to stop asking questions just because we want him to. Rey exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. All right. He looked at Ethan, something heavy settling behind his eyes. There's more you need to know, and none of it's going to make tonight any easier. I'm listening. Marcus Kane isn't just running an old motorcycle club gone bad, Rey said, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily like the weight of the conversation was physical. He's built a whole operation around fear dressed up as community pride, sponsors the 4th of July parade, donates to the elementary school. Half this town thinks he's some kind of local hero because he shows up with a check and a smile whenever the cameras are rolling. And behind the cameras, he's got men going door to door telling small business owners they need security services whether they ask for them or not. Telling ranch families their cattle might have accidents if they don't sign leases they don't want to sign. It's the same playbook his father ran, just polished up nicer for a generation that's better at hiding things behind a smile. Rey's hands curled into fists on the table. Your grandfather spent the last 15 years of his life quietly working against that in ways Marcus never fully figured out. Slipping money to families who got squeezed. Warning people before Marcus's men showed up. Doing what he could without ever putting the jacket back on because he knew the second he did, Marcus would come for all of us. And now I put it on, Ethan said, his voice hollow, without knowing any of that. Now you put it on, Rey agreed, and within an hour half the county knows about it. Sarah's phone buzzed again on the counter, and this time all 3 of them froze. She crossed the kitchen, slowly checked the screen, and her face went rigid. What is it? Ethan asked. It's Ruth Ortega, Sarah said, her voice tight. She answered, put it on speaker, her hand shaking slightly as she set the phone on the table. Sarah! A woman's voice came through, older frightened words tumbling out too fast. Sarah, I'm sorry to call so late. I didn't know who else to call. There were men here tonight. At the store. 2 of them invest. They didn't say who they were with, but I know, Sarah, I know exactly who sends men like that. They said if we don't sell the lot behind the store by the end of the month, there's going to be an accident. A fire, maybe. They didn't say it exactly like that, but that's what they meant. Ethan's blood went cold. Ruth, are you safe right now? Sarah asked, her voice fighting to stay calm. For tonight, yes. But Sarah, I heard something else. One of them, before they left, he said something strange. He said, tell Billy Walker's people the old promises don't mean anything anymore. I didn't understand it until my neighbor told me an hour ago that Billy's grandson was walking around town tonight wearing his old jacket. Sarah, is that true? Is that boy in danger because of us? Ethan stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. He grabbed the phone before his mother could stop him. Mrs. Ortega, this is Ethan. Ethan Walker. My grandfather made a promise to your family a long time ago, and I intend to keep it. Ethan, honey, no. Ruth's voice cracked with fear. You're just a boy. You shouldn't be involved in any of this. Please just take that jacket off and let this be. I'm not taking it off, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. Lock your doors tonight. I'm coming by first thing tomorrow, and we're going to figure this out together. He ended the call before his mother or Rey could argue, and the kitchen went dead silent, three sets of eyes locked on each other in the aftermath. Ethan, Sarah said slowly, you cannot make promises like that. You don't have any power to protect that family. You're 17. Then help me find some, Ethan shot back. You said Grandpa spent 15 years quietly working against Marcus Kane without anybody knowing. So there has to be something, money contacts, something that he left behind to actually do that. Ray and Sarah exchanged another one of those loaded glances, and this time Ethan caught the flicker of something that looked almost like hope buried underneath all the fear. The safety deposit box, Ray said quietly. Billy's letter mentioned it, didn't it? Box 114, Ethan confirmed. First Desert Bank. Bank doesn't open till 9 tomorrow, Ray said. But Ethan, whatever's in that box, it's not going to be a magic solution. Whatever your grandfather was building, he was building it slow, careful over years. You can't undo 15 years of Marcus Kane's operation with whatever fits in a safety deposit box overnight. Then we start slow and careful too, Ethan said. But we start. Sarah studied her son for a long moment, and something in her face shifted the fear still there. But something else rising up alongside it. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like she was seeing her father-in-law's stubbornness reflected back at her through her own son's eyes. And for the first time in 8 years, that resemblance didn't just terrify her. It steadied her. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, tomorrow morning we go to the bank together. All three of us. And then what? Ethan asked. And then, Ray said, standing, his voice hardening, with a resolve Ethan hadn't heard from him before. We figure out how to keep that promise without getting anybody killed in the process. Starting with getting Cole and maybe Frank in a room, laying every card on the table and figuring out exactly how deep Marcus Kane's operation actually runs. You said not to trust Frank, Ethan reminded his mother. I said don't go looking for him alone, Sarah corrected. That's different from never talking to him again. If he really does know things Cole doesn't, and if he's telling the truth about wanting to make amends, she exhaled hard. Then maybe it's worth hearing him out. Carefully, not alone in some garage at night. A car engine rumbled outside, slowing as it passed the house, and every single person in that kitchen went still listening. The sound faded, continued on down the street, and Ethan realized his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. We can't live like this, he said quietly, jumping at every car that drives by. No, Ray agreed, we can't, which is exactly why we're not going to just sit here and wait for Marcus Kane to decide what happens next. Sarah picked the letter back up off the table, reading it again silently, her thumb tracing over her father-in-law's handwriting like she could feel him through the ink. He knew this day might come, she said softly. He wrote this letter knowing that someday, somehow, you'd end up standing exactly where you're standing right now. Then I guess I better not let him down, Ethan said. Ray placed a heavy hand on his nephew's shoulder, gripping it firm. You're not alone in this, Ethan. Whatever your grandfather built quietly over 15 years, the people he helped, the debts he was owed, some of that's still out there. Cole, Frank maybe, people we don't even know about yet, who owe Billy Walker more than they've ever said out loud. Tomorrow we start finding them. The kitchen fell into a heavy, exhausted quiet, the kind that follows an earthquake once the shaking finally stops, but before anybody's brave enough to check the damage. Ethan looked down at the shoebox still open on the table, the photographs of his grandfather, young and fearless, the letter written in a dying man's careful hand, the small brass key that felt impossibly heavy in his palm. There's one more thing, Sarah said quietly, almost hesitant. Something I probably should have told you the second you asked about Frank Delgado. What? Frank isn't the only one from the old days still in this county, she said. There's a woman too. Someone your grandfather trusted more than almost anyone else in the Sentinels back before it all fell apart. She left the life entirely, moved out past the reservation line, doesn't talk to anybody from those days anymore. But if there's a person alive who knows exactly what Billy was building these last 15 years, who he was protecting, what resources he had, what Marcus Kane is actually capable of, it's her. Who is she? Sarah hesitated, glancing at Ray, who gave a small, reluctant nod. Her name is Delia Reyes, Sarah said. Ethan's stomach dropped for the second time that night. Reyes, like Danny Reyes, the guy from the diner, Marcus's second. Sarah's face was grim. Danny's mother. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it that night, Heavier, sharper, loaded with a complication none of them had seen coming. Ethan stared at the letter in his hands, at the key, at his uncle's tired, worried face, and felt the full weight of what his grandfather had left behind finally settle onto his shoulders. "So the woman who might be able to help us," he said slowly, "raised the man who just threatened to kill me tonight." "It's more complicated than that," Sarah said. "It always is with this town, with this family." Delia left Danny's father, Marcus's father's closest enforcer, when Danny was 12 years old because she couldn't stomach what the club had become. Danny stayed with his father, grew up in it, became exactly what Delia was running from. Her voice softened with an old, tired grief. She spent 20 years grieving the son she couldn't save, Ethan. If anyone in this town understands what it costs to lose someone to Marcus Kane's world without a single drop of blood being spilled, it's her. Ethan looked down at the jacket he was still wearing. The weight of the patch suddenly feeling like something entirely different than it had an hour ago. Not just history, not just danger, but a thread connecting every broken family in this town to the same unfinished promise. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "The bank, then Cole. Then if we can find a safe way to do it, Delia." "And Frank?" Ray asked. Ethan hesitated, thinking of the man in the parking lot, the quiet weight in his voice, the debt he claimed to owe a dead man. "Carefully," he said finally, "like Mom said. But yeah, him too." Sarah reached across the table and closed her hand around her son's, the same way she used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms, except this time, neither of them had any illusions that the storm was going to pass on its own. "Your grandfather used to say something," she said quietly. "Back before any of this happened, back when your father was still alive, and none of us knew how much we were going to lose. He used to say the Sentinels' whole code came down to one idea, that the people with the least power in a room deserve the most protection, and if you're strong enough to give it, you're obligated to." She squeezed Ethan's hand. "I think that's exactly what you're feeling right now, whether you've got the words for it or not." "I don't feel strong," Ethan admitted. "I feel like I just found out my entire life was built on top of things nobody bothered telling me." "That's exactly how strength usually starts," Ray said quietly. "Feeling like the ground under you isn't solid and deciding to build something new on top of it anyway." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling against the windows, carrying with it the distant low rumble of a motorcycle engine passing somewhere out on the main road, not stopping, not slowing, just passing through the dark, like a reminder that the world Ethan had stepped into that night wasn't going back to sleep just because the sun had gone down. He picked the brass key up off the table, turning it over once in his fingers, feeling its weight settle into his palm like it belonged there. 9 o'clock, he said. "The bank opens at 9. 9 o'clock, Sarah confirmed, though her eyes stayed locked on the jacket, on the patch, on the son who looked so much like the father-in-law she'd buried, and the husband she'd lost, both of them staring back at her now through the same stubborn, unafraid eyes. None of them said it out loud, but all three of them understood, sitting there in that quiet kitchen, with a shoebox of secrets open between them, that whatever Billy Walker had built in 15 years of silence was about to be tested in ways he'd never had the chance to prepare for, and that whatever waited inside that safety deposit box was only the very first door in a house that had a great many more still locked. Morning came too fast, sunlight cutting through Ethan's bedroom blinds like it hadn't gotten the memo that his entire world had cracked open the night before. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch, the jacket draped over his desk chair the whole night, watching him the way a loaded gun watches a room. By 8:40, he was standing in the kitchen in jeans and a plain t-shirt. No jacket, not yet his mother's request, while Sarah paced by the window, checking the street every few seconds like she expected Danny Reyes' face to appear in it. "Ray's meeting us there," she said, grabbing her keys off the counter. "He didn't sleep either. Called me at 5 in the morning, wanting to change the plan 3 different times." "What's the plan now?" "Same as last night. Bank, box 114. We see what your grandfather left, and then we figure out our next move based on what's actually inside instead of guessing." The drive to First Desert Bank took 11 minutes, and every single one of them felt like an hour. Ethan watched the side mirror the entire way, half expecting a black pickup to appear behind them, but the road stayed empty, quiet, deceptively ordinary. Ray was already waiting in the parking lot when they pulled in, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, looking like a man who hadn't touched coffee yet and desperately needed to. "You bring the key?" he asked as Ethan climbed out. Ethan held it up between 2 fingers. "All right." Ray straightened, glancing toward the bank's glass doors. Let's go find out what kind of mess your grandfather left us. The bank manager, a nervous younger man named Dale, who clearly recognized the Walker name and clearly wished he didn't lead them down to the vault without much conversation, his eyes flicking to the jacket Ethan had put back on the second they left the truck. He unlocked the outer door with his own key, then stepped back so Ethan could insert the brass one into box 114. The box slid out heavier than Ethan expected. They carried it into a small private viewing room, and Dale shut the door behind them without being asked, muttering something about taking as long as you need before disappearing entirely. Sarah's hands were shaking again as Ethan lifted the lid. Inside, a thick manila envelope sealed, a small black thumb drive taped to an index card, a stack of cash bound with a rubber band, more money than Ethan had ever seen in one place. And beneath all of it, a single sheet of paper folded once with 3 words written across the top in his grandfather's rough handwriting. For the fight. Open the envelope first, Ray said quietly. Ethan's fingers weren't steady, but he managed it. Inside were photographs, surveillance-style grainy, clearly taken from a distance. Men handing envelopes to other men in parking lots. A photo of a black SUV parked outside a house Ethan didn't recognize, time-stamped 14 months ago. And copies of documents, bank transfer records, a list of names with dollar amounts beside them, and one page that made Sarah gasp out loud when she saw it. That's Grady Tolliver's signature, she whispered. Who's Grady Tolliver? Ethan asked. The county sheriff, Ray said grimly, taking the page from Sarah's hand, his jaw tightening as he read it. This is a payment record, $12,000 routed through a shell account dated 3 days before your father's accident report was filed. He looked up, his face pale under the fluorescent light. Ethan, your grandfather wasn't just collecting proof against Marcus Kane. He had proof the county sheriff was on Kane's payroll. The room seemed to tilt slightly. That's why nobody ever investigated Dad's death properly, Ethan said slowly, the pieces sliding into place with sickening clarity. It's not that nobody cared. It's that the man in charge of caring was being paid not to. We can't go to local police with this, Sarah said, her voice tight with a fresh wave of fear. If Tolliver's compromised and we hand this to the wrong deputy, we know, Ray said, which means whatever your grandfather was planning to do with this evidence, he never got the chance to finish it, or he was waiting for something. Somebody outside the county, state police, FBI maybe. Ethan picked up the thumb drive, turning it over in his fingers. What do you think is on this? Only one way to find out, Ray said. Not here, though. Down on any computer connected to this bank's network. Sarah unfolded the final sheet of paper, the one marked "For the Fight," and read it aloud, her voice catching on every other word. If you're reading this, then somebody finally forced my hand, or I ran out of time before I could finish what I started. This money isn't for spending on yourselves. It's for protecting the people I promised to protect, the Ortegas and others you'll find listed on the thumb drive. Use it to help them relocate if they need to pay lawyers, if it comes to that, to do whatever keeps them safe while the rest of this plays out. The photographs and records are everything I gathered in the last 3 years, documenting Marcus Kane's operation and Grady Tolliver's involvement in covering for him. It's not complete. I was still building the case when I ran out of road. Find someone you can trust outside this county, state investigators, a journalist, anybody without Kane's money in their pocket, and finish what I started. Be careful who you trust close to home. Not everyone wearing an old patch stayed loyal to what it meant. Not everyone who left the club did it for the reasons they claim. Ethan felt the words land like ice water. Not everyone who left the club did it for the reasons they claim, he repeated. Is that about Frank? Nobody answered right away. It could be, Ray said finally, carefully, or it could be about somebody else entirely. Billy didn't name names in that letter for a reason, Ethan. He wanted you to be careful with everybody, not just one person. Sarah folded the letter back up, her hands still trembling. We need to talk to Cole, now, before we do anything else. They called him from the parking lot, and Cole answered on the first ring, his voice tight with the particular exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept either. He agreed to meet them at his place outside town within the hour, his tone carrying an urgency that made Ethan's stomach knot even tighter. But before they'd even pulled out of the bank lot, Sarah's phone rang again. Ruth Ortega's name flashed on the screen, and this time her voice, when Sarah answered, wasn't just frightened, it was frantic. Sarah, they came back, this morning right after we opened. Spray painted the front window, a skull, and underneath it, 30 days. My husband wanted to call the sheriff, and I told him no. I told him don't, and he's asking me why, and I don't know how to explain without sounding insane. Don't call the sheriff, Sarah said quickly. Ruth, listen to me. Do not call Grady Tolliver's office. We'll explain everything, but not on the phone. Can you stay at the store until we get there? We're not going anywhere, Ruth said, her voice hardening with a stubbornness that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of his own. This is our family's store. 40 years. I am not letting some coward with spray paint chase us out of it. We're coming, Sarah said. 15 minutes. Ray's knuckles were white on the steering wheel the whole drive over, and Ethan sat in the back seat with the shoebox on his lap, the weight of it feeling heavier by the mile. When they pulled up to the hardware store, the skull was still there, black paint dripping down the glass like a wound, the number 30 circled beneath it in a way that felt almost gleeful. Ruth Ortega came out to meet them before they even reached the door. A small, fierce woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, her husband Manny standing just behind her, a broom in his hand like he'd been scrubbing at the paint and given up. You must be Billy's grandson, Ruth said, studying Ethan with an intensity that made him want to stand up straighter. You look just like him. God help you. Mrs. Ortega, I'm so sorry about this, Ethan said. I promise you, we're going to figure out how to protect your family. Honey, your grandfather made that same promise 40 years ago to my father, Ruth said not unkindly, and it worked for 4 decades right up until it didn't, so forgive me if I'm not ready to celebrate just yet. That's fair, Ethan said quietly. Manny finally spoke, his voice low and rough. 2 men. Didn't say who sent them, didn't need to. One of them had a tattoo on his neck, some kind of skull with wings. Recognized it from a flyer the sheriff's office put out a few years back about motorcycle gang activity. Except nothing ever came of that flyer, did it? Funny how that works. Because the sheriff's on Kane's payroll, Reyes said grimly, and both Ortegas went very still. You have proof of that? Manny asked. We have proof of a lot of things, Sarah said. That's what we came to tell you. Billy left evidence. Records, photographs, financial documents, all connecting Kane's operation to Sheriff Tolliver directly. We don't know the full picture yet, but we know enough to know we can't take this through official channels in this county. Ruth's hand went to her chest. Then what do we do? For now, Ethan said, surprising himself with how steady his own voice came out. You don't sign anything. You don't sell that lot behind the store no matter what they threaten. And you let us help you the way my grandfather intended to. He glanced at the shoebox still in his hands. There's money here, not a fortune, but enough to get you a lawyer enough to reinforce security on this building, if it comes to that. We don't want charity, Manny said, pride flaring hot behind the fear in his eyes. It's not charity, Ethan said firmly. It's a promise being kept. 40 years late maybe, but kept. Something in Ruth's face softened, just slightly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes that she blinked back hard. Your grandfather used to come by every few months, she said quietly. Never announced it. Just showed up, bought something small, asked how we were doing. I always thought it was just kindness. I didn't understand until years later he was checking on us, making sure nobody had come around. He never stopped, Ethan said, and for the first time since the diner, he felt something other than fear settle into his chest, something that felt almost like purpose. A car rounded the corner down the block, slowing as it approached, and every single person outside the hardware store tensed at once. But it was only an old sedan, an elderly man behind the wheel, oblivious to the tension he had walked into. He passed by without a glance, and the group exhaled in ragged unison. We can't keep doing this, Ray muttered, dropping in every time a car turns a corner. Then we move fast, Ethan said. Cole's expecting us within the hour. We need to bring him this evidence, figure out who we can trust to actually do something with it. They left the Ortegas with a promise to return by evening and a hastily arranged plan for Ray to send one of his garage employees to keep an unofficial eye on the store through the afternoon. The drive to Cole's place, a modest single-story house on the edge of town with a detached garage that looked older than Ethan himself, passed in tense silence. Cole was waiting on his porch when they arrived, and the moment he saw the shoebox in Ethan's hands, his expression shifted into something grave and focused. He actually did it, Cole said almost to himself as they climbed the porch steps. Billy actually built a case. You knew he was working on something, Sarah asked. I suspected. He was careful even with me. Cole led them inside into a cluttered living room filled with old photographs and motorcycle memorabilia that told the story of a man who'd never fully let go of the road even after he'd stopped riding it professionally. Let's see what he left. They spread the contents across his coffee table, and Cole went through the photographs and documents with the careful, practiced eye of someone who'd spent years learning to read danger in small details. His face grew grimmer with every page. "This is Grady Tolliver's handwriting on this transfer authorization," he confirmed, tapping the page. "I'd recognize it anywhere. Man used to sign my speeding tickets back when I was young and stupid enough to earn them." He set the page down carefully. "If this is real, and I've got no reason to think Billy would fake something like this, then Marcus Kane's entire operation has been protected by the county sheriff for at least 3 years." Grandpa's letter said not to trust everybody who left the club close to home, Ethan said carefully, watching Cole's face for a reaction. "Do you know what that means?" Cole's expression flickered, hurt maybe, or defensiveness before settling into something more controlled. "I have my guesses," he said, "but I think it's time you heard the rest of the story from somebody who was there for all of it, not just the parts I lived through." "Frank," Ethan said. "Frank," Cole confirmed, though his voice carried something uneasy. "And somebody else too. Somebody I haven't spoken to in almost 15 years. But if we're doing this, if we're actually doing this, we need her." "Delia Reyes," Sarah said quietly. Cole's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You know about Delia?" "I told him last night," Sarah said. "Everything I know, which honestly isn't much beyond her name, and what she walked away from." Cole sat back heavily in his chair, rubbing his beard, clearly weighing something. "Delia knows things nobody else alive knows," he said finally. "She was there the night the club split in two. She heard things said in that room that Gerald Kane and your grandfather both tried to bury afterward. If anybody can tell you the full truth about what happened 30 years ago, the truth even I don't have all of, it's her." "Then let's go talk to her," Ethan said. "It's not that simple," Cole warned. "Delia's spent 20 years building walls around herself. She doesn't trust bikers, doesn't trust anybody connected to the old club, and given who her son works for now, showing up unannounced, wearing that jacket might not get you a conversation. It might get you a door slammed in your face." "Then we call first," Sarah suggested. "She doesn't have a phone that anybody from the old days has the number to," Cole said. "That was deliberate on her part." "So how do we reach her?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, something conflicted working behind his eyes. "There's one man who still knows how to find her," he said finally, reluctantly. "And it's the same man I told you to be careful of last night." "Frank," Ethan said again. "Frank," Cole confirmed. "For all his history, all the things he did during his years with Gerald Kane Delia never fully cut him off. I think there's guilt on both sides that ties them together even now. If anybody can get you a real conversation with her, it's him." Ray leaned forward, his expression hard. "Cole, level with us. Do you actually trust Frank Delgado, or are you just out of better options?" Cole considered the question with a seriousness that Ethan appreciated, even as it made his stomach twist tighter. "I trust that Frank genuinely loved your grandfather once before everything went sideways," he said carefully. "I trust that whatever guilt he's carrying about the years he spent with Gerald Kane was real, not performed. What I don't fully trust is whether 20 years of guilt is enough to make a man risk his life going up against Marcus Kane directly. That's the piece I can't promise you." "Then we go in careful," Sarah said. "Together. Not Ethan alone, not at night, not in some empty garage." "Agreed." "I agreed," Ray said firmly. Cole nodded slowly, then reached for an old flip phone sitting on his side table, dialing a number from memory. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Frank, it's Cole. I've got Billy's family here. They want to talk. All of it out in the open, no more half-truths." A pause. "Yeah, today, if you can manage it." And Frank, Cole's voice hardened slightly. "If you're going to help us reach Delia, this is the moment. Not next week, today." Whatever Frank said on the other end made Cole's shoulders relax just slightly. "He'll meet us at the garage on Route 9 in an hour," Cole said, hanging up. "Says he'll bring Delia if she's willing. No promises." The hour felt endless. Ethan sat in Cole's cluttered living room, the shoebox contents spread across the table like evidence in a trial nobody official was ever going to hear, and tried to steady the storm building behind his ribs. Every few minutes his mind circled back to the same haunting phrase from his grandfather's letter. Not everyone who left the club did it for the reasons they claim, turning it over. Searching for the shape of a threat he couldn't quite see clearly yet. When they finally pulled up to the old Sentinel garage on Route 9, a squat, weathered building with a faded sign nobody had bothered to replace in decades, Frank Delgado was already waiting outside, leaning against a motorcycle that looked older than Ethan himself. Beside him stood a woman Ethan had never seen before, tall, silver-haired, with a face carved by hard years and harder decisions, her eyes locking onto Ethan's jacket the moment he stepped out of the car. "So it's true," the woman said quietly. "Billy's grandson. Wearing that patch like it doesn't weigh 1,000 pounds. Delia Reyes," Cole said, stepping forward. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't come for you, Cole," Delia said not unkindly, her eyes still fixed on Ethan. "I came because Frank told me a 17-year-old boy walked into Rosie's diner wearing his grandfather's jacket, and Marcus Kane's men are already threatening families over it. That's not a coincidence. I could ignore whatever I promised myself 20 years ago about staying out of this world." They moved inside the garage, dust hanging thick in the beams of light, cutting through gaps in the old walls, and settled around a workbench that had clearly seen 30 years of hard use. Ethan laid the evidence out again, watching Delia's face as she studied each photograph, each document, her expression unreadable, until she reached the page bearing Grady Tolliver's signature. "I always wondered how Marcus kept that badge so quiet for so long," she said softly. "Now I know." "Mrs. Reyes," Ethan said carefully, "my grandfather's letter said not everyone who left the club did it for the reasons they claim. Cole thought maybe you'd know what that means." Delia's eyes flicked to Frank, something heavy and old passing between them, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. "He's talking about me," Frank said, finally, his voice rough. The room went utterly still. "I didn't leave the Sentinels because I grew a conscience, Ethan," Frank continued, forcing the words out like they cost him physical pain. "Not at first. I left because Gerald Kane found out I'd been skimming money off a protection racket he ran through the club, and he was going to make an example of me. I ran to Billy, your grandfather, begging for protection, and he gave it to me. Took me in, vouched for me, even though half the men who'd left with him didn't trust me an inch. He said everybody deserves one real chance to become better than what they've been. So you owe him your life," Ethan said slowly. "I owe him everything," Frank said. "And for years I told myself that was enough, that just staying quiet, staying out of trouble was payment enough for what he did for me. But it wasn't. Because while I was staying quiet, Gerald Kane was building an empire on fear, and then his son inherited it and made it worse. And I never lifted a finger to stop any of it because I was too scared of what would happen if Marcus figured out I was the reason your grandfather knew as much as he did." Sarah's head snapped up. "Wait, you were feeding Billy information for 15 years, Frank admitted. Quietly, carefully. Every scrap of intelligence in that shoebox that didn't come from Billy's own eyes came filtered through me one way or another. I still had contacts inside Kane's Operation Old Friends who never fully trusted Marcus but were too deep in to leave. I passed what I learned to Billy, and Billy built his case." "Then why didn't Grandpa's letter trust you?" Ethan asked, confusion and something like betrayal tangling in his chest. Frank's face crumpled slightly, an old grief surfacing. "Because 2 years ago I made a mistake," he said quietly. "Marcus started suspecting there was a leak. I panicked. I gave him a name to protect myself. Not Billy's name, I'd never have done that. But I gave him a name that got an innocent man hurt. Badly hurt. A man who had nothing to do with any of it, just somebody Marcus decided to make an example of based on my lie." His voice broke. "Billy found out what I'd done. He never told anybody. But he stopped fully trusting me after that, and he was right not to. That's what the letter means, Ethan. He wasn't warning you away from me entirely. If he was, he'd never have let Cole keep me anywhere near this family. He was warning you that even the men trying to do right can still make choices that hurt people when the fear gets bad enough." The confession hung heavy in the dusty air, and Ethan found himself studying Frank's face, searching for the lie, finding instead only raw, exhausted honesty. "Does Marcus know you're still feeding information?" Ray asked sharply. "He suspects," Frank admitted, "which is exactly why I need you to understand something important right now before this goes any further." He straightened his voice, hardening with urgency. "Ruth Ortega's store getting marked this morning, that's not random escalation. Somebody told Marcus that Billy's family was already pulling together evidence and already reaching out to old contacts. That means there's a second leak, somebody closer to you than me. And Marcus is moving faster than any of us expected. The room went cold. Somebody's been talking, Delia said grimly, which means whatever plan you're building, you need to build it, assuming Marcus already knows more than he should. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, sharp and sudden in the tense silence, and he nearly dropped it, fumbling to answer. It was Ruth Ortega's number again, and the second he picked up, he knew from the sound of her breathing alone that something had gone terribly wrong. Ethan. Her voice was shaking so badly he could barely understand her. Ethan, they're back. There's more of them this time, 4, maybe 5. They've got something, I think it's gasoline, oh God, Ethan. They're pouring it around the back of the line went dead. Ethan's blood turned to ice. They're setting fire to the Ortegas' store right now. Chaos erupted in the garage, Ray already moving for the door. Cole grabbing his keys, Frank swearing under his breath, and reaching for a helmet hanging on the wall, Delia's face gone pale and furious all at once. Call it in, Sarah said desperately. Fire department. We have to call somebody. Not the sheriff's line, Frank barked. Call the fire department, directly bypass dispatch if you can, but do not let this route through Tolliver's office, or Marcus will have 5 extra minutes to make sure his men are long gone before anybody official shows up. Ethan was already moving adrenaline, drowning out every ounce of fear that had kept him frozen the night before sprinting for Reyes' truck, with the jacket flaring out behind him like a flag. He didn't think about Marcus Kane. He didn't think about danger, about warnings, about anything, except the image of Ruth Ortega's terrified voice cutting off mid-sentence. Ethan, wait. Sarah's voice, desperate, chasing him across the gravel lot. He didn't wait. He climbed into the truck beside Ray, who was already gunning the engine tires, spitting gravel as they tore out onto Route 9, with Cole's bike roaring to life behind them, and Frank's a beat after that, the whole ragged convoy racing toward town with a single terrifying thought hammering through every one of them. They weren't going to make it in time. The smoke was visible from 6 blocks away, a thin gray column rising into the pale afternoon sky, and Ethan's stomach dropped through the floor of the truck as Ray floored it through a red light, horns blaring behind them, nobody caring in the slightest. There, Ray shouted, pointing. The hardware store came into view, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Flames licked up the back wall near the storage shed, thick black smoke pouring skyward and standing in front of the burning structure. Illuminated by the orange glow was a small cluster of figures, Ruth and Manny Ortega frozen in horror, and 4 men in dark vests standing between them and their own burning building, watching the fire spread with the casual indifference of men who'd done this before. And standing slightly apart from the others, his face unreadable in the firelight, was Danny Reyes. Ray slammed the truck to a stop, and Ethan was out the door before it had fully halted, his feet hitting pavement, his whole body moving on pure instinct toward the fire, toward the Ortegas, toward the men who'd set it. Ethan stopped. Sarah screamed, distant, useless against the roar of his own pulse. Danny turned at the sound of the truck doors, and his eyes locked onto Ethan across the burning lot, something complicated and unreadable flickering across his face as he took in the jacket, the patch of the boy who wasn't backing down even now. Get back, Danny called out, but his voice carried something strange in it, not quite a threat, closer to a warning aimed at protecting rather than attacking. Kid, I mean it. Get back. Call the fire department, Ethan shouted at Manny, ignoring Danny entirely, his eyes darting between the flames and Ruth's terrified face. Is anybody still inside? No, we got out. We got out in time, but the store 40 years. Everything we... Manny's voice broke completely. One of the other men in vests stepped forward, something metallic catching the firelight in his hand, and Ethan's whole body went rigid with a fear sharper than anything he'd felt yet. Danny, the man said low in warning, this isn't the plan. We finish this and we leave. We don't stand around chatting with Billy Walker's kid. Danny didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Ethan, on the jacket, on the patch that had apparently haunted this entire town for 30 years, and for one long, suspended moment, nobody in that burning parking lot moved at all. Danny. Ethan said, his voice shaking but steady enough to carry, you don't have to do this. Whatever they've got on you, whatever's keeping you tied to this. You don't know anything about me, Danny snapped, but there was no real heat behind it, just old tired pain. I know your mother, Ethan said. I know she's been grieving you for 20 years. The words landed like a physical blow. Danny's face went white, his jaw tightening, his hand curling into a fist at his side. She's here, Ethan pressed, gambling everything on instinct alone. She came today, Danny. She's trying to help us, she can help us stop Marcus. For one terrifying electric second, Ethan thought he'd made a fatal mistake. Thought Danny's face was about to twist into fury. Thought the man beside him was going to close the last few feet between them with whatever weapon he was holding. Instead, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, and every single man in a vest froze at the sound. Fire department's coming, the man beside Danny hissed. We're gone. Now! Danny hesitated one final agonizing second, his eyes still locked on Ethan's, something desperate and conflicted burning behind them. Tell her, he started, then stopped, himself shaking his head hard, turning away before he could finish whatever he'd been about to say. He and the other three men were gone in seconds, engines roaring to life, tearing off down a side street just as the first fire truck rounded the corner. Ethan stood frozen in the parking lot, the heat of the flames washing over his face. Ruth Ortega sobbing into her husband's shoulder a few feet away, and the last thing he saw before the firefighters swarmed the scene was Danny Reyes' taillights disappearing into the smoke-choked afternoon, carrying with them a sentence that had been left dangerously, unbearably unfinished. The firefighters had the blaze under control within 20 minutes, but the storage shed was a total loss, and the back wall of the store itself was scorched black smoke still curling from the charred wood, even after the last hose was shut off. Ruth Ortega stood wrapped in a blanket. One of the paramedics had draped over her shoulders, staring at the damage with an expression that had moved past crying into something hollower, quieter. 40 years, she kept saying almost to herself. 40 years, and they took it in 20 minutes. The building's still standing. Ruth, Sarah said gently, an arm around the older woman's shoulders. The store's still standing. That's not nothing. For how long, though? Ruth turned to her eyes, red-rimmed but sharp with a fury that hadn't burned out with the fire. This was a warning. Next time it won't be the shed. Ethan stood a few feet away, still catching his breath, still feeling the ghost heat of the flames on his face when he noticed Cole watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Pride maybe tangled up with something closer to fear. You walk straight at a burning building and armed men, Cole said quietly, coming to stand beside him. That wasn't brave, Ethan. That was reckless. Would you have done any different? Ethan asked. If you'd heard Ruth's voice cut off like that. Cole didn't answer right away. No, he admitted finally. But I'm 61 years old and I've already lived my life. You've barely started yours. Danny didn't hurt me, Ethan said. He could have. That guy next to him wanted to, but Danny stopped it. I saw, Cole said grimly, and I don't like what that might mean. What do you mean, man? Before Cole could answer, Frank came jogging over from where he'd parked his bike, his face tight with urgency. We need to get off this street, he said. Fire department called it in through normal channels, which means Tolliver's office already knows there was an incident here, and it's only a matter of time before somebody connects Billy Walker's grandson, standing in the middle of it, to whatever story Marcus decides to spin. Spin? How? Sarah asked sharply. However benefits him, Frank said. Could be he tells people the fire was an accident and paints Ethan showing up as suspicious. Could be worse. Point is, we shouldn't be standing around here waiting to find out. They regrouped at Reyes' garage 20 minutes later. The whole ragged group crowded into the back office. Ethan, Sarah, Ray, Cole, Frank, and Delia, who'd followed on a borrowed truck, her face still carrying the shock of watching her son disappear into smoke without finishing whatever he'd tried to say. Tell her, Ethan said quietly, turning to Delia. What Danny started to say, tell her, and then he stopped. Delia's composed exterior cracked for just a moment, her hand pressing flat against her chest like she could hold something together by force. I don't know what he meant, she said, her voice unsteady. I haven't spoken to my son in 6 years, Ethan. Not since he told me to stop coming around, told me I'd already made my choice when I left his father, and he'd made his. He didn't sound like a man who hates his mother, Ethan said carefully. He sounded like a man who's stuck. Stuck is dangerous, Frank said grimly. Stuck men do desperate things to protect the only life they've got left, even when part of them hates that life. Can we use that, Ray asked. If Danny's genuinely conflicted, We are not putting a 17-year-old boy in the position of trying to flip Marcus Kane's own second in command, Sarah said sharply, cutting Ray off. Absolutely not. That's not a plan, that's a suicide mission. Nobody said anything about Ethan doing it alone, Delia said quietly, and every head in the room turned toward her. But if there's a crack in Danny, if some part of him still remembers who his mother is, still remembers what decency looks like, then maybe I'm the one who needs to try reaching him. Not Ethan. Delia, that's not safe either, Cole said. Nothing about any of this is safe, Delia snapped back, more forceful than she'd been all afternoon. I have spent 20 years telling myself staying away was protecting him. Maybe it was just protecting me. I don't know anymore. But I'm not going to sit in a garage while my son stands between a burning building and an old woman's whole life's work, clearly hating every second of it, and do nothing. The room fell quiet, the weight of her words settling over all of them. Let's table Danny for a minute, Ray said finally, ever the pragmatist. We've got bigger problems sitting right in front of us. The Ortegas need protection tonight, real protection, not just a promise. And we need to figure out what to actually do with the evidence sitting in that shoebox before Marcus decides burning a shed was just the opening move. I might have an idea about that, Frank said slowly, and something in his tone made everyone look at him. There's a woman I know used to be an investigative reporter for a paper out of Phoenix before budget cuts killed her position. She's been doing independent work since, mostly corruption stories, county-level stuff. Nobody big enough wants to touch. She did a piece 3 years ago on land grabs in a county 2 hours south of here, similar playbook to what Marcus is running. I still have her number. You think she'd be interested in this? Sarah asked. I think a story connecting a sitting county sheriff to a criminal enterprise running extortion and arson is exactly the kind of story that makes careers, Frank said. The question is whether she can move fast enough and carefully enough to actually protect the people involved instead of just breaking the story and disappearing back to Phoenix. Call her, Ethan said. Today, now. Frank glanced at Cole, some old wordless conversation passing between them, then pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway. The room sat in tense silence while his muffled voice carried faintly through the door, rising and falling with an urgency that made Ethan's pulse climb higher with every passing second. He came back 5 minutes later, his expression unreadable. Her name's Marisol Vega. She's driving up from Phoenix tonight. Wants to see the evidence herself before committing to anything, but she didn't hang up on me, and that's more than I expected. How long until she gets here? Ray asked. 3 hours, maybe less if she pushes it. Then we've got 3 hours to figure out how to keep the Ortegas safe until she arrives and figure out what we're walking into with Marcus Kane before he decides fire wasn't enough of a message. Ray said, standing already moving toward action, the way he did whenever fear threatened to freeze him instead. They split up fast, Ray heading back to the hardware store with 2 of his garage employees to help board up the damaged section and keep a visible presence through the evening. Cole and Delia driving out to check on a few other families who'd once been under the old Sentinels' protection, families who might now be vulnerable if Marcus was escalating faster than anyone anticipated. That left Ethan, Sarah, and Frank at the garage, the shoebox spread open on Ray's cluttered desk, sorting through the evidence one more time, trying to organize it into something coherent enough for a reporter to actually use. Your grandfather was thorough, Frank said, studying a page of financial records with something like admiration. This isn't the work of an angry old man with a grudge. This is 3 years of careful, patient documentation. He knew exactly what he was building. He just ran out of time to finish it, Ethan said quietly. Or he was waiting for the right moment, Frank countered. Billy wasn't reckless, whatever people wanted to believe about him. If he was still gathering evidence when he died, it's because he didn't think it was strong enough yet to survive Marcus and Tolliver both coming after him with everything they had. Is it strong enough now? Ethan asked. Frank considered the question seriously, flipping through several more pages. It's strong, he said finally, but it's not complete. There's a gap here. He tapped a section of the financial records between what Marcus is paying Tolliver and where that money's actually coming from. If this reporter is going to build a case that holds up, she's going to need to trace the source of Marcus's income. And unless I'm wrong, that's going to lead somewhere your grandfather never quite finished chasing. Where land deals, Frank said grimly, ranch families getting pressured to sell. Remember, I always suspected there was a bigger player behind that, somebody with real money using Marcus's operation as muscle to clear land cheap before flipping it for a fortune. Billy suspected it too near the end. He just never got the proof. Sarah's face had gone pale listening. If there's someone bigger behind Marcus, she said slowly, someone with real money and real reach, that changes everything, doesn't it? That's not just a local biker gang problem anymore. No, Frank agreed, it's not. The office door swung open before anyone could respond, and Ray strode back in, his face tight with fresh urgency, a folded piece of paper in his hand. Found this taped to the garage door, he said, tossing it onto the desk. Whoever left it wasn't shy about being seen doing it. Security camera caught a man on a motorcycle, no plate, dropping it off about 20 minutes ago. Ethan unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Typed, not handwritten, deliberately impersonal. Tell the boy this ends tonight, one way or another. Marcus wants a meeting. Neutral ground, the old fairgrounds, 8 o'clock. He comes alone wearing the jacket, or he doesn't come at all, and Marcus assumes the family's declared war. Your choice. The room went utterly silent. Absolutely not, Sarah said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Absolutely 100% not. He is not walking into a meeting alone with the man who murdered his father. Mom. No, Ethan. No, this isn't a discussion. Sarah snatched the paper up, her hands trembling. This is exactly the kind of trap your grandfather warned us about. Marcus wants you alone, isolated, no witnesses. You go to those fairgrounds tonight, and there's a very real chance you don't come home. And if I don't go, Ethan said, his voice quieter but no less firm. He said war. He's already burned down half the Ortega's property. What does he do next if he thinks we're refusing to even talk? We don't know that showing up changes anything, Frank said carefully. For all we know, this is exactly what it looks like, an ambush dressed up as a negotiation. Or, Cole said slowly, having just walked back in with Delia behind him, catching the tail end of the conversation. It's exactly what it says it is, a meeting. Marcus didn't get where he is by being stupid. Killing Billy's grandson in cold blood, especially now that there's a reporter driving up from Phoenix, would be an enormous risk for him. He's got more to lose than we might think. You're suggesting we trust him, Sarah said incredulously. I'm suggesting we don't assume the worst without understanding what Marcus actually wants, Cole said. There's a difference. Ethan set the letter down slowly, his mind racing, weighing fear against the same stubborn instinct that had carried him straight toward a burning building that afternoon without a second thought. What if I don't go alone, he said finally. What if I go, but not unprotected, not unwatched? What if the meeting happens exactly the way Marcus wants it to look, but underneath it, we're not as exposed as he thinks? Explain, Ray said. Frank said Danny stopped that man at the fire from doing something worse. Ethan said, thinking out loud, now the pieces assembling themselves faster than he could fully articulate them. Danny's clearly conflicted. What if part of tonight's meeting isn't really about Marcus testing me? What if some part of Marcus is testing whether Danny's still loyal because he suspects the same crack in his second that we all just witnessed? That's a lot of speculation to risk your life on, Sarah said. I'm not finished, Ethan said. What if Delia comes? Not into the meeting, nowhere near. It nowhere Marcus would see her, but close enough that if Danny's still got any decency left in him, and he sees his mother is somewhere nearby, willing to be there for him after 20 years of silence, that might matter. Might be the thing that tips him toward protecting me instead of standing by while something happens. Delia's face had gone very still, very pale. You want to use me as bait for my own son's conscience, she said quietly. I want to give him a reason to remember who he used to be before all this, Ethan said, meeting her eyes steadily. I'm not going to pretend that's not a risk for you too. The room sat with that for a long, heavy moment. There's something else, Frank said slowly. If we're doing this, if Ethan's actually walking into that meeting, we don't go in blind. I know that fairground. I rode with the Sentinels through a dozen gatherings there back in the day. There's a maintenance road behind the old grandstand that gives a clear line of sight to the main lot without being visible from it. If Cole and I position ourselves there, we're not interfering. We're not violating whatever terms Marcus sets, but we're watching. And if something goes wrong, you're 40 yards away and useless. Sarah snapped, panic breaking through her controlled exterior for the first time all day. I can't lose him too. I can't. Do you understand that I already buried my husband because of these people? I am not burying my son. Mom, Ethan crossed the room, kneeling in front of where she'd sat down hard in one of Reyes' office chairs, taking both her hands in his. I hear you, I do. But think about what happens if I don't go. Marcus declares war, he said so himself. The Ortegas are already targets. Who's next, us, you? I can't sit here and let more people get hurt because I was too scared to hear out whatever he actually wants. You don't owe Marcus Kane a conversation, Sarah said, tears finally spilling over. You don't owe this town anything, Ethan. You're 17 years old. I'm not doing it for the town, Ethan said quietly. I'm doing it because Grandpa spent 15 years quietly protecting people, and Dad died trying to expose the truth, and I am not going to be the walker who ran the first time things got hard. His voice cracked, but he held her gaze steady. I need you to trust me the way you trusted them. Sarah closed her eyes, a fresh wave of tears sliding down her face, and for a long moment nobody in the room spoke, letting her have the silence to fight through whatever war was happening behind her closed eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted, the panic still there, but tempered now by a resolve that mirrored her son's. If you're doing this, she said, her voice steadier than before, then we do it exactly the way Frank described. Cole and Frank in position. Delia nearby but safe. And I want a way to hear what's happening in real time. Ray, you still have those old radio units from the garage's security setup. I can rig something, Ray said immediately, already moving toward a back cabinet. Small enough to hide under the jacket collar. Not perfect, but it'll let us hear if things go sideways. And if things go sideways, Frank said grimly, Cole and I are not 40 yards away and useless. We're 40 yards away and moving in the second it matters. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Ray soldering together a makeshift transmitter from spare parts, while Cole and Frank studied a hand-drawn map of the fairgrounds, marking sight lines and exits. Delia sat quietly through most of it, her hands folded tightly in her lap, occasionally murmuring something about the son she used to know, memories surfacing now that she'd clearly kept buried for years. At 6:30, headlights swept across the garage windows, and everyone froze until Frank checked and confirmed it was Marisol Vega, the reporter, arriving earlier than expected. She turned out to be sharp-eyed, maybe 40, with the exhausted, alert energy of someone who'd spent years chasing stories nobody wanted told. She spent 40 minutes going through the evidence with a focus that bordered on reverence, occasionally muttering things like, this is real, and oh, this is very real under her breath. This is enough to open an investigation, she said finally, looking up at the room full of anxious faces. Not enough to convict anybody today, but enough to force state investigators to take a look, especially with the sheriff connection. I can have this in front of people who matter by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow might be too late, Sarah said quietly. Ethan's meeting Marcus tonight. Marisol's face sharpened with alarm. Tonight? Absolutely not. We know, Ray said grimly. We're doing what we can to make it as safe as possible, but it's happening. Marisol studied Ethan for a long moment, something calculating and concern moving behind her eyes. If you're really doing this, she said slowly, I want to be nearby too. Not for the story, for your safety. Journalists show up in unexpected places all the time. If Marcus knows there's a reporter parked at the edge of those fairgrounds with a phone that's already transmitting live to an editor in Phoenix, that's one more reason for him to keep tonight civil. You do that? Ethan asked. Kid, I've been chasing this exact kind of story for 6 years, Marisol said. I'm not about to let the best lead I've ever had walk into danger alone if there's something I can do about it. By 7:30, the plan was as tight as they could make it on short notice. Ethan driving to the fairgrounds alone as instructed, the small transmitter hidden beneath his jacket collar. Cole and Frank positioned on the maintenance road behind the grandstand. Delia parked a quarter-mile down the access road, close enough to reach the fairgrounds fast if needed, far enough to stay hidden. Marisol parked on the opposite side, her phone already recording, feeding footage directly to a cloud server she had with a note attached that would auto-send to her editor if she didn't check in within the hour. Sarah and Ray stayed back at the garage with the radio receiver, and the last thing Sarah did before Ethan climbed into his truck was pull him into a fierce, desperate hug, holding on longer than either of them could really afford. Come home, she whispered into his shoulder. Whatever happens in there, you come home to me. I will, Ethan promised, though his voice shook saying it. The drive to the fairgrounds took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours, the desert sky bruising purple and orange as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the old fairground gates looming ahead of him like the mouth of something waiting to swallow him whole. He parked where the note had instructed in the center of the empty main lot and killed the engine. For a moment, nothing happened. Just silence whine moving dust across cracked asphalt. The distant creak of an old Ferris wheel frame nobody had bothered dismantling in a decade. Then headlights appeared at the far end of the lot, one set, then two, then four motorcycles rolling in slow and deliberate engines growling low like predators circling. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped out of his truck, the jacket heavy on his shoulders, every instinct screaming at him to run. He didn't run. The bikes fanned out in a loose semicircle 30 feet from his truck, and from the center of them a man dismounted, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, silver hair, slicked back a face that might have been handsome once before hardness carved it into something colder. He wore his colors openly, the current Sentinels patch stitched crisp and new over his heart. And even from 30 feet away, Ethan could feel the weight of his presence. Understand instantly why this man commanded fear from grown bikers twice Ethan's size. Marcus Kane studied him for a long moment, his eyes tracing the old patch on Ethan's jacket with an expression that flickered between contempt and something almost like grief. "You look like him," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying easily across the empty lot. "God help you, you really do." "You knew my grandfather," Ethan said, forcing his voice steady. "I knew him my whole life," Marcus said. "Watched him humiliate my father in front of every man who mattered right before he walked out and left the rest of us to clean up whatever mess he decided wasn't worth staying to fix." His jaw tightened. "You want to talk about legacy, kid? Let's talk about what it's like growing up as the son of the man Billy Walker publicly destroyed. He destroyed your father because your father turned a Brotherhood into an extortion racket." Ethan said, his voice shaking but not backing down. "I've seen the proof, Marcus. I know exactly what you've built on top of what your father started." Something flickered across Marcus's face, surprise. Maybe that a 17-year-old would say it to his face without flinching. "Careful," one of the bikers behind him muttered low. Marcus raised a hand, silencing him without even looking over. "Let the kid talk," he said. "I want to hear what Billy's ghost has to say through his grandson's mouth." Ethan's pulse pounded, but he held Marcus's gaze. "I know about Grady Tolliver. I know about the payments. I know about the land you're pushing families off of so somebody with real money can flip it for profit. And I know you burned down the Ortegas' shed this morning to scare an old woman who never did anything to you except run an honest business for 40 years. The lot went dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "That's a lot of accusations from a boy who just found out his grandfather existed 48 hours ago. Marcus said, but there was something careful in his tone now, something that hadn't been there before. "I found out my grandfather spent 15 years quietly protecting this town from you," Ethan shot back. "I found out you killed my father because he tried to expose you. And I found out there's a reporter in Phoenix who's about to make sure every piece of evidence my grandfather gathered sees daylight, whether you like it or not." Marcus's face went very still, very dangerous. "Careful, kid," he said, quieter now, more lethal. "You're standing in the middle of an empty fairgrounds, surrounded by men who do a lot worse than burn a shed if I gave the word." Ethan's whole body was shaking, but he forced himself to stand his ground, forced his voice to stay level even as terror clawed up his throat. "Then give the word," he said, "because I promise you, Marcus, if something happens to me tonight, that evidence doesn't disappear with me. It goes straight to state investigators tomorrow morning, regardless. You'll have traded one dead walker for a murder investigation with your name written across every page." For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat roaring in his ears, could feel the weight of every biker's eyes on him, could sense somewhere in the darkness beyond the lot that Cole and Frank were watching, ready to move, and that Delia was sitting a quarter mile away with her whole broken heart wrapped around whatever her son chose to do in the next 60 seconds. Then Marcus laughed, short, humorless, almost impressed. "You really are his blood," he said, "stubborn as hell, even staring down into the barrel of something you don't fully understand." He took a step closer, and Ethan forced himself not to retreat. "Here's what you don't understand, kid. I didn't bring you out here tonight to kill you." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to look Billy Walker's legacy in the eye and decide for myself whether it was worth the trouble of dealing with," Marcus said. "And you know what I see?" He studied Ethan for a long moment. I see a boy who's about to get himself, his mother, and everybody he loves buried in a war he doesn't have the resources to win. Whatever proof you think you've got, kid, it means nothing against a man with Tolliver's badge and half a county's business interests protecting him. It means something to a reporter who doesn't answer to anybody in this county, Ethan said. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a flicker of genuine calculation, the first real crack Ethan had seen in his composure all night. There's no reporter, Marcus said, but it came out less certain than his previous words. There's a reporter, Ethan confirmed, parked less than a quarter mile from where we're standing right now, recording everything with the instructions to send it straight to her editor if she doesn't hear from me within the hour. Marcus's eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness beyond the fairground lights, and for the first time all night, Ethan saw something in the man's face that looked almost like uncertainty. Danny, Marcus said sharply without turning around, check the perimeter. Ethan's heart stopped. Danny Reyes stepped forward from among the circle of bikers, and their eyes met across the lot, the same conflicted, haunted look from the burning parking lot that morning. Except now there was something else there too, something that looked almost like decision finally being made. Danny didn't move toward the perimeter. Danny, Marcus repeated sharper now, an edge of warning in his voice. There's no need to check, Danny said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent lot. I believe him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every biker in that circle turned to stare at Danny, disbelief written across their faces, and Marcus's expression cracked into something furious and dangerous all at once. Excuse me, Marcus said, his voice dropping low and lethal. I said I believe him, Danny said louder this time, stepping forward until he stood between Marcus and Ethan, his own body suddenly unmistakably a barrier. I saw the fire this morning, Marcus. I saw what we did to that old woman's family. And I'm done pretending that's the kind of man I want to be. The lot exploded into chaos, bikers shouting, Marcus's face contorting with rage, hands moving toward jackets in ways that made Ethan's blood run cold. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fairground lights, he heard the distant, unmistakable roar of two motorcycle engines igniting Cole and Frank, finally moving, closing the distance fast. You're choosing him, Marcus snarled at Danny, over your own family, over everything I've given you. You didn't give me anything, Danny shot back, his voice breaking with 20 years of buried grief. You took my mother from me the day I chose my father's world over hers, and I have hated myself for it every single day since. I'm done. Marcus's hand moved fast, reaching for something at his belt, and Ethan's entire body seized with terror. And then headlights flooded the lot from every direction at once. Cole and Frank roaring in from the maintenance road, Delia's truck screeching to a stop at the entrance, and Marisol Vega's voice sharp and clear, calling out from the shadows near her car. This is being recorded and live-streamed to my editor in Phoenix right now, she shouted. Every word, every face. I'd think very carefully about your next move, Mr. Kane. The lot froze in a suspended electric silence, every single person caught in the impossible tension between violence and consequence. And Ethan stood in the very center of it, his heart hammering his father's killer, 6 feet away, with his hands still hovering near a weapon, and Danny Reyes standing between them both, finally after 20 years choosing which side of his own soul he was going to live on. Marcus Kane's hand hovered at his belt for what felt like an eternity, the entire fairground frozen in that single suspended breath, every engine, every voice, every heartbeat waiting on what he'd do next. Then slowly, deliberately, he let his hand drop back to his side. Smart, Marisol called out from the darkness, her phone still raised, still recording. Very smart, Mr. Kane. Turn that off, Marcus snapped, but there was no real force behind it anymore. Just the hollow anger of a man who understood the ground had shifted beneath him faster than he could control. Not a chance, Marisol said, stepping into the light now, her voice steady despite the danger still humming through the air. Everything that's happened here in the last 5 minutes is already sitting on a server in Phoenix. Attacking me now doesn't erase it. It just adds assault on a journalist to the growing list. Cole and Frank had pulled their bikes to a stop just inside the lot, engines idling, both men positioned in a way that put them squarely between Ethan and the nearest of Marcus's riders. Delia stood beside her truck at the entrance, her eyes locked on her son with an intensity that seemed to be holding the entire night together by sheer force of will. Danny, Marcus said, turning back to him, his voice low, almost pleading beneath the fury. Think about what you're doing. Think about everything you've done for me. Danny's laugh was bitter, cracked at the edges. You mean the 15 years you spent making sure I never had a way out? making sure every mistake I made tied me tighter to you until I couldn't imagine being anything else. He shook his head slowly. I watched a 17-year-old kid walk straight at a burning building today because he refused to let fear make his choices for him. That's when I understood Marcus. I've been letting fear make every choice of mine for 20 years. You'll lose everything, Marcus warned. I already lost everything, Danny said quietly. I lost it the day I chose you over my mother. I'm just finally done pretending otherwise. The other bikers shifted uneasily, glancing between Marcus and Danny, clearly uncertain which way loyalty was supposed to bend in a moment like this. One of them, older heavyset, finally spoke up, his voice rough. Marcus, this is getting out of hand. There's a reporter, there's a kid with proof, and now Danny's turned. We need to think about... Nobody asked you to think, Marcus snapped, but his eyes were scanning the lot now, doing math. Ethan could almost see happening behind them, counting witnesses, counting risks, counting exactly how much control he had left in a situation that had spiraled far past what he'd planned when he sent that note taped to Reyes' garage door. Sirens cut through the tension, suddenly distant, but growing closer, red and blue light beginning to bleed across the horizon beyond the fairground gates. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, and for the first time all night, real fear flickered across his composed face. Who called that in? I did, came a new voice, and every head turned toward the fairground entrance, where a state police cruiser was just rolling to a stop, an officer stepping out with a posture that carried none of the deference local law enforcement had apparently been showing Marcus Kane for years. Special Agent DS, Arizona Department of Public Safety. Got a call about an hour ago from a journalist named Marisol Vega about a possible extortion and arson case connecting to county officials. Figured I'd come see for myself what all the fuss was about. Ethan's knees nearly buckled with relief. Beside him, he heard Cole let out a long, shaky breath. Marcus's face had gone pale, calculating fast. This is a private property dispute, he said, forcing calm into his voice. Nothing here concerns state police. Funny, Agent Diaz said, walking closer, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The bikers, the boy in the old leather jacket, the reporter with your phone still recording. Because I've got a recording being fed to my office in real time that suggests otherwise. Something about a payment to Sheriff Grady Tolliver and an admission just now about setting fire to a family business this morning. He stopped a few feet from Marcus, unbothered by the 6 armed bikers surrounding him. Why don't we all take a drive down to the station and sort out exactly what concerns state police and what doesn't? The night dissolved into a blur after that, more sirens arriving, more officers. Marcus and 2 of his men taken in for questioning, while the others scattered into the darkness, their loyalty evaporating the moment consequences became real. Ethan stood at the center of it, his legs finally giving out the adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation. And it was Sarah's arms that caught him when she came sprinting across the lot from where she and Ray had raced over the moment the radio transmission cut off mid-conversation. You're okay, she kept saying over and over, her hands running over his face, his shoulders checking for damage that wasn't there. You're okay, oh my God, Ethan, you're okay. I'm okay, Mom, he said, his voice shaking but whole. I'm okay. Delia had crossed the lot too, standing a few feet from her son, both of them frozen in an awkward, aching silence 20 years in the making. Danny finally looked up, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time in 6 years, and whatever walls had been holding both of them apart for 2 decades cracked open all at once. Mom, he said, his voice breaking completely. Delia closed the distance in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around him. And the sound that came out of Danny Reyes then wasn't anything like the cold, controlled man who'd walked into Rosie's diner the night before. It was the sound of a boy who'd been lost for 20 years, finally allowing himself to be found. Agent Diaz spent the next hour taking statements, collecting the evidence from the shoebox, with a careful professional reverence that told Ethan this man understood exactly what he was holding. This is going to take time, Diaz warned them, tucking the manila envelope into an evidence bag. Corruption cases involving law enforcement move slow, especially when you're building something that has to survive a defense attorney tearing it apart in court. But this, he held up the financial records. This is more than enough to open a formal investigation tonight. Sheriff Tolliver is going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer before the sun comes up. What about Marcus? Ethan asked. Arson, extortion, and whatever else we find once we start pulling threads, Diaz said. He's not walking away from tonight the same man he was yesterday, I promise you that. He studied Ethan for a moment, something almost gentle in his professional demeanor. Your grandfather's work made this case, son. I want you to understand that. Whatever else happens from here, the evidence he spent 3 years building, the reason this actually sticks instead of disappearing into a filing cabinet somewhere. The drive home that night felt unreal, the desert dark and quiet around them. Rey's truck rattling along Route 9 with Ethan wedged between his mother and uncle, the jacket finally mercifully still no longer carrying the electric tension it had held for the last 24 hours. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much left to say that the silence didn't already understand. But the story wasn't over that night, not by a long stretch, and the following weeks unfolded with a slow, grinding intensity that tested every ounce of resolve the Walker family and their unlikely allies had built in that fairground parking lot. Sheriff Grady Tolliver resigned within a week, the state investigation moving fast enough that he clearly understood fighting it would only make things worse. He wasn't arrested immediately, the case needed to build. Agent Diaz explained patiently to a frustrated Ethan more than once, but his career, his reputation, his easy authority over the county, all of it collapsed practically overnight once Marisol Vega's story broke. And it broke big, bigger than any of them had expected. The patch that brought down a county. The headline read, splashed across not just the Phoenix paper, but picked up by outlets across the state. Within days, the story of a 17-year-old boy wearing his dead grandfather's jacket into a diner, and the chain of events it set into motion, capturing something the public couldn't look away from. Reporters started showing up outside Rey's garage, outside the Walker house, hoping for interviews. Ethan mostly declined, still too raw, too exhausted by everything that had happened to turn it into a performance for cameras. But Ruth Ortega, standing in front of her half-burned hardware store, gave an interview that ran on 3 different news stations, her voice fierce and unshakable, as she described 40 years of quiet protection, finally repaid in the moment her family needed it most. Billy Walker made a promise to my father in 1974. She told the cameras, her chin lifted, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall on camera. That promise outlived him. It outlived everything Marcus Kane tried to do to erase it. That's what real honor looks like, not the kind you talk about, the kind you carry forward even after the person who made the promise is gone. Marcus Kane's arraignment happened 3 weeks later, and Ethan sat in the courtroom gallery beside his mother, watching the man who'd killed his father stand before a judge in a county that could no longer protect him. His silver hair and expensive lawyer, doing nothing to soften the weight of the charges, being read aloud. Extortion, arson, conspiracy, and thanks to a break in the financial records that trace clearly back through years of documentation. Accessory charges connected to the still unsolved question of Michael Walker's death 8 years earlier. That charge alone brought Ethan to tears in the courtroom, his mother's hand gripping his so tight it left marks, both of them finally. After 8 long years watching the machinery of justice turn toward the truth instead of away from it. It's not over, Sarah warned him gently that night, sitting on the edge of his bed the way she used to when he was small. Cases like this take years sometimes, Ethan. There will be appeals, there will be delays. It's not going to feel finished for a long, long time. I know, Ethan said, but it's finally moving in the right direction. That's more than we had a month ago. The land conspiracy Frank had suspected turned out to run deeper than any of them anticipated. State investigators following the financial trail Billy Walker had started, and Marisol Vega had helped bring into the light, eventually traced Marcus's operation back to a development company based out of Scottsdale, quietly buying up ranch land across 3 counties at prices far below value, using intimidation and fear to force families into selling before they understood what their land was actually worth. 2 executives from that company were indicted alongside Marcus, and Ethan watched almost dizzy with disbelief as a story that started with a jacket in a diner unraveled into something that touched dozens of families across the entire region. The Ortegas rebuilt their storage shed with help from a community fund Sarah organized, almost without meaning to donations pouring in from people across the state who'd read Marisol's story and felt something stir in them about a town that had finally stood up against men who'd terrorized it for decades. Rey's garage saw more business than it had in years. People driving from surrounding towns just to shake the hand of the uncle of the boy who'd worn his grandfather's jacket into a fight nobody else had been brave enough to start. Danny Reyes cooperated fully with investigators, providing testimony that proved crucial in building the case against Marcus. And though he faced his own legal consequences for years spent inside Kane's operation, the cooperation and the clear moment of moral reckoning at the fairground weighed heavily in his favor when sentencing eventually came. He moved in with Delia during the months the case unfolded, the two of them slowly, carefully rebuilding 20 years of distance, one difficult conversation at a time. "I keep thinking about what you said to me that night," Danny told Ethan one afternoon, the two of them sitting on the tailgate of Reyes' truck outside the garage months after the fairground, the desert heat finally starting to break with the coming of autumn. "About my mother grieving me for 20 years. I didn't even know that was true until you said it." "Would it have changed anything if you'd known sooner?" Ethan asked. Danny considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything now slow and deliberate, a man rebuilding his own moral compass, one careful step at a time. "I don't know," he admitted. Maybe I needed to hit rock bottom before I could climb back up. But I'm glad I finally know it now. I'm glad she gets to be my mother again, even if I don't deserve it. Everybody deserves a chance to become better than what they've been," Ethan said quietly, echoing words Frank had said to him weeks earlier. Words that had apparently once come from Billy Walker himself, passed down now through 3 generations of men trying to outrun their own mistakes. Frank Delgado never fully forgave himself for the man he'd hurt years earlier through his panicked lie to Marcus. But he spent the months following the fairground, working quietly to make amends, tracking down the man he'd wronged, and through Marisol's connections, helping arrange restitution that no court had ordered, but that Frank insisted on paying anyway. Cole watched his old friend's slow redemption with a complicated mixture of pride and lingering caution. But by the time winter arrived, something like real trust had settled between them again, the kind that had been broken for years and was only now carefully being rebuilt. Cole himself became something Ethan hadn't expected. Not quite a grandfather figure, nothing could replace what he'd lost, but something adjacent to it. A steady presence who showed up at the garage most weekends, teaching Ethan things about motorcycles that went beyond mechanical repair. Things about patience, about reading a road before you committed to it, about understanding that speed without control was just another word for recklessness. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing to me," Cole told him one Saturday afternoon, both of them elbow deep in the engine of an old restoration project Cole had taken on a bike, not unlike the ones in those faded photographs from the shoebox. Said control wasn't about holding back. It was about knowing exactly how much power you could handle before you let it loose. "Sounds like he was talking about more than motorcycles," Ethan said. "He usually was," Cole agreed, a small, sad smile crossing his weathered face. The jacket itself became something of a local legend in Silver Ridge, though not in the way it had been feared that first night in Rosie's diner. People stopped whispering when Ethan walked in wearing it. Instead, they nodded, some of them with a quiet respect that felt earned rather than intimidated, the old veterans at the window table occasionally raising a coffee cup in silent acknowledgement whenever he passed. The patch that had once made grown men go pale with fear had transformed slowly into something else entirely, a reminder not of what the Sentinels had become under Gerald and Marcus Kane, but of what they'd been founded to be, what Billy Walker had spent his entire life, even after leaving the club, trying to honor. Rosie kept a photograph behind the diner counter, now one Marisol had taken that first week of coverage. Ethan, standing outside the diner in the jacket, his expression steady, unafraid, the desert sun behind him. She never said much about it, just nodded toward it, sometimes when new customers asked, letting the story speak for itself the way stories in small towns eventually do pass from table to table until they become something closer to folklore than fact. Sarah found herself in the months that followed, slowly stepping into a role she'd never expected, advocating alongside Ruth, Ortega, and several other families who'd been quietly terrorized over the years, helping organize what eventually became a small but determined community watch network. Families looking out for each other the way the original Sentinels had once promised to do before greed and fear corrupted the promise. It wasn't a motorcycle club, nobody wore patches or colors, but it carried the same spirit forward, the same idea Billy Walker had carved into a clubhouse wall decades before Ethan was even born: we ride for the ones who can't. "I think he'd be proud of you," Sarah told Ethan one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch where this entire journey had truly begun, the same kitchen table visible through the window behind them, where she'd finally told him the truth about his father. "I think he'd be proud of all of us," Ethan said. "You, Ray, Cole, even Frank in his own complicated way. This wasn't just me, Mom. I couldn't have done any of it alone. No, Sarah agreed, resting her head against his shoulder the way she used to when he was small enough for her to be the one offering comfort instead of the other way around. None of us could have. That's the whole point, isn't it? That's what he was trying to tell you in that letter. The patch doesn't make the man, but the man doesn't have to carry it alone either. The trial against Marcus Kane finally concluded 14 months after that night. At the fairground, the courtroom packed with people from 3 counties who'd followed the case with the kind of investment usually reserved for something much closer to home, because for many of them it was. The jury's verdict came back guilty on every major charge, the judge's sentencing handing down decades that all but guaranteed Marcus Kane would spend the rest of his functional life behind bars. His empire of fear dismantled piece by piece by the very evidence a grieving father had spent his final years quietly assembling. Ethan sat in that courtroom between his mother and his uncle, the old leather jacket draped over the back of his chair rather than on his shoulders, not out of fear anymore, but out of a strange, settled understanding that some moments called for simply being. Ethan Walker, 17. No 18. Now the year having turned quietly somewhere in the middle of all this without needing the weight of history stitched across his back to prove anything to anyone. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters gathered again, and this time Ethan didn't turn away from them. He stood on the steps, his mother beside him, Ray and Cole a few feet back, and he said the words that would end up quoted in nearly every article written about the case in the weeks that followed. People keep asking me if I'm proud of what happened. He said, his voice steady in a way that would have surprised the terrified boy who'd walked into Rosie's diner over a year earlier. I'm not proud. Pride feels like the wrong word for something that started with my father being murdered and a family losing 40 years of their life's work to a fire. What I feel is grateful. Grateful that my grandfather spent 15 years quietly protecting people, even after he lost everything trying to do the right thing. Grateful that a reporter took a chance on a story nobody else wanted to touch. Grateful that a man everybody expected to stay loyal to, fear, instead chose his conscience at the worst possible moment for himself and the best possible moment for everyone else. He paused, glancing back at Danny, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd beside his mother, both of them finally fully reunited. This jacket taught me something I don't think I ever would have learned otherwise. It's not about the patch. It's not about the name stitched into old leather. It's about what you're willing to protect when protecting it costs you something. The following spring, Silver Ridge held its first community fair in the newly rebuilt lot behind the Ortega hardware store, funded partly by the settlement money that had eventually come through from the land conspiracy case, partly by donations from a community that had learned the hard way what happens when good people stay silent too long. Ruth Ortega cut the ribbon herself, her hands steady, this time no fear left in them at all. Ethan stood near the back of the crowd, the jacket on his shoulders again, not out of necessity this time, but out of choice, out of a quiet pride that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with honoring a man he'd only truly come to know after his death. Cole stood beside him, and Frank a few feet away, deep in conversation with Delia about something that made her laugh, for the first time Ethan had heard since this whole story began. Danny stood near his mother, a hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Both of them slowly, patiently rebuilding a relationship that had taken 20 years to break and would likely take 20 more to fully heal. But that was healing all the same. Sarah found him in the crowd, wrapping an arm around his waist, watching the town come together in a way none of them could have imagined the night this all started. You know, she said quietly, your grandfather used to tell me something back when your father was still alive, back before any of us understood how much we were going to need to hear it someday. She looked up at her son, her eyes bright with a grief that had finally, after everything, found its way towards something like peace. He said, legacy isn't about being remembered for what you did. It's about the people who keep doing right because of what you started. Ethan looked out at the crowd, the Ortegas laughing with Ray near the food stands, Cole and Frank arguing good-naturedly about some old motorcycle part, Marisol Vega, who'd stayed in touch and become something like a friend to the whole family, snapping photographs of the fair for a follow-up piece, Danny and Delia standing close together under the late afternoon sun and understood fully and completely what his mother meant. I used to think this jacket was just an old piece of leather, he said quietly, something that belonged to a man I barely got to know. And now I think it was never really about the jacket at all. He looked down at the patch on his shoulder, faded, worn 30 years old, and carrying a weight far heavier than leather and thread should have been able to hold. It was about a promise, and promises don't die just because the person who made them does. They just wait for somebody brave enough to carry them forward. Somewhere behind them, the sound of an old motorcycle engine rumbled to life, and for just a moment, standing there in the golden light of a town that had finally fully healed, Ethan swore he could feel his grandfather's presence in it, not haunting, not grieving, just quietly, proudly, watching a promise finally completely kept. Because in the end, that was the truth. The whole town had learned the hard way. The truth that had started with a single confused sentence in a diner and ended with an entire county rebuilding itself around something better than fear. A legacy was never inherited through blood. It was earned choice, promise by promise, until the person carrying it forward became someone worth remembering in their own right. And whenever Ethan Walker rode through the streets of Silver Ridge, wearing his grandfather's old leather jacket, nobody whispered anymore. They simply nodded, understanding at last what that faded patch had always been trying to say, that honor doesn't disappear when the man who taught it dies. It waits patiently for the next person willing to wear it honestly. That was Billy Walker's true legacy. Not fear, not power, not even the jacket itself, just a promise kept.